for Dataprise CYBER. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with the EC Council University. Before we begin, I'll just go over just a little bit about myself. As I just said, my name is Tim Foley. I'm a cyber executive with over 15 years of cross-sector industry experience, holding a number of industry certifications, along with being committed to the Six Sigma process improvement practice. And I'm also a member of the GIAC Advisory Board. I currently serve as the Director of Information Security for Dataprise CYBER, a full-service managed security services provider based out of Rockville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. So that's enough about me. Let's dive into what we're going to be talking about today. Before we begin, I think it's important to clearly define the terms SMB, or small, medium-sized businesses, and enterprise to give us a baseline for our conversation today, as they can vary pretty wildly depending on who you ask and what the context is. So for our purposes today, SMB organizations will generally be the sub 2,500 seat or employee environments, and enterprise organizations being those greater than 2,500 seats. And if you want to use a revenue total for that, loosely purposed, that would be the sub $500 million in revenue organizations. Not doing basing this off of complexity or sites or security culture, just painting a simple broad stroke for our conversation. So as we're talking about SMBs, small, mid-sized organizations, sub 2,500 seats, less than 500 million in revenue, generally speaking. To start off, we're going to go over some of the notable data security breaches that have occurred over the past few years. And we're going to talk about why SMBs are a target relative to their enterprise counterparts. We're going to go through business risk and take us from business risk to cyber resilience. What can we do as organizations to make that shift, a very important shift from business risk to cyber resilience? And we're going to talk through some cybersecurity recommendations for the SMB to help improve and harden our security posture. So let's jump right in. Notable data security breaches. Now, we see on this list Home Depot is here, and just after the Home Depot breach, the Home Depot's board chair was quoted as saying, "We believed we were doing things ahead of the industry. We thought we were well positioned." And I think each of the boards of directors, each of the C-suite in charge of the companies that you see listed here below, would have said something similar. They thought they were in a good position to prevent a large data breach. They thought that they were doing things at or ahead of the industry and their competitors. But as time and records have shown, they were not. So just taking a look at some of these, obviously Adobe with 38 million records back in 2013. Target, as we all know from the Thanksgiving timeframe, 110 million records. eBay with 38 million. JP Morgan, 83 million records. Our friends over at Home Depot with 56 million back in 2014 as well. And Home Depot, following this breach, their profits fell 40%, 90 lawsuits. And according to court documents, the total cost for Home Depot of that breach and the subsequent cleanup, fines and everything related, was $179 million. Not a small total there. And then, of course, Marriott International from late last year with 500 million records. The total cost for that breach is still being calculated and may rise also into the hundreds of millions, as there are some GDPR concerns there that may inflate that total. The total cost for, based on, as we look at these breaches, and back to Target's just for a second, based on Target's own annual financial report from 2016, the total cost of that breach was almost 300 million, 292 million to be exact, according to Target's internal data. So what we can see is not insignificant breaches, very large organizations, and all of these breaches resulted in large fines, lawsuits, personal monitoring for victims, legal costs, forensics, and many other direct costs to the business, as well as indirect costs, brand damage, reputational damage to each of these businesses. But what this graph has shown us is, although there was a very near-term hit to the business, in Home Depot's case, profits fell 40% over the next quarter and a half. They were able to rebound. They were able to take that initial hit and come through the other side, and even in all of these cases, become a stronger company as a result, at least in a shareholder sense. Adobe, Target, eBay, JP Morgan, and Home Depot, 1 year after their data breach, had even higher share prices than they did prior to the data breach. So what this shows us is that these companies were all too big to fail. They had the people, money, structure, resources to recover from these massive events. But what about the rest of us? The rest of us with limited IT budgets, still working on the business value case for comprehensive security spend. Now, I would share a great many of the smaller breaches, the ones typically in the SMBs that we're going to be discussing more of today. But to be honest, they don't often make the papers. The victims are often never notified. The companies just go out of business in the majority of cases, as you can see above. And their market share is quietly absorbed by their local competitors. From the National Security Alliance statistics, 60% of small and mid-sized businesses that are hacked go out of business within 6 months. And what we saw is it's a combination of both the direct and the indirect costs, the fines, the monitoring, the forensics. That has a significant impact to the business, as the company needs a substantial amount of cash flow at the ready to make that payment. And then they have to duck and cover for a quarter or two while the reputational damage hopefully subsides, and hopefully the brand recognition is strong enough to come through the other side of that, and to rebuild itself stronger than it was. But for many of us in the SMB, the brand is not strong enough or resilient enough to withstand that. So within that first 6 months, we find ourselves unable to recover. So how can we ensure that we don't become one of those smaller companies that fall victim to that fate? Unfortunately, there are no silver bullets and there are no guarantees, but there are plenty of things that we will talk about today that will help move us from business risk towards cyber resiliency. So when we talk about why SMBs are a target, I think it's very important to first recognize and acknowledge the cybersecurity conundrum in the SMB. The cybersecurity conundrum appears when the SMB and mid-market is challenged with buying security. Often their budget allows them to either buy a tool or find people to operate, but not both. You can either buy the car or buy the gasoline, but one without the other does not get you very far. And no, this isn't a shameless plug for electric cars, but you understand where I'm going with this. If you can't afford both in unison working with one another, you're always going to fall short of your end goal. So what you end up finding more often than not is mid-market security directors, CISOs, and engineers on these magical quests for either silver bullet point solutions, which don't exist, or pink elephant security operators who can multi-thread, threat hunt, reverse engineer malware, script, and who love working 24 hours a day as a king or queen of all trades. Now, tongue in cheek here, but you get my point. So this becomes our conundrum. But why are SMBs such a target? Well, we know our information is valuable. If you have a business, you have valuable information. In the internet age, data is the new currency and is being bought, sold, and traded at record rates. With an average cost of $217 per stolen record, according to the Ponemon Institute, all data has value, and it adds up quickly. You're an easier target. Small and mid-sized businesses often lack the technical, physical, and administrative controls to govern their environments and prevent an attack. In fact, 65% of small and mid-sized businesses have no data security policy in place. Many have no security policies at all in place. This is according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. For an attacker, it's low risk and high returns. Attackers can develop a single attack and reuse it against many targets with no additional overhead and little fear of being caught. Attackers don't need a high success rate here. A fraction of a percent will do. And since there's no overhead associated with the attack, they can keep reusing and reusing to their heart's content. Think phishing and other business email compromise threats. Low level of effort, high volume. SMBs are also potentially more susceptible to these types of single attack reuse threats because of their longer refresh cycles. In an attempt to get every last dollar of value out of the current equipment cycle, SMBs often stretch their hardware and software, meaning that they often run up against end-of-life equipment and hardware and software cycles. This can lead to outdated security and patching, which makes for very easy for threat actors to bypass multiple security layers and pivot very quickly within an organization. If we have end-of-life hardware and software running within our environment, we know that they are vulnerable. And the longer that end-of-life hardware is in place and hardware and software is in place, the more exploits will be created for it, and we know that no more patching is coming. Attackers know this too. In security, you are only as strong as your weakest link. And I think the upcoming Windows 7 end of life is a perfect example. Maybe you have 90% of your workstation fleet on Windows 10, but if you do not have a solid plan in place to replace or upgrade the remainder of your Windows 7 machines over to Windows 10 prior to the end of life date in January 2020, then you can fall victim to this exact example. And unfortunately, the attackers know that. Online presence. In order to be a business in 2019, there's a pretty good chance that you must be online. You must be online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is a good thing because that's how you're gaining a presence, you're building your brand, and you're attracting new customers. But it also means that your surface area to be attacked is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You take the good with the bad. A lack of awareness. Now we'll talk about user awareness, we'll talk about general awareness and security awareness. In this case, it's more of a too much focus internally on running and growing the business to place enough importance on cyber attacks. And there's often no formalized user awareness programs or metrics internally. So we don't know how susceptible our user population is to these advanced attacks that come in through phishing, which is a very common attack vector these days. So it becomes a secondary priority to the executive team focused on growing the business, and we aren't able to formally track, or we haven't been formally tracking well enough, our users' susceptibility to the new types of threats that are coming into our environments. Too much noise. Even when cyber tooling does exist in the SMB, they're often point solutions that do not integrate with one another, which causes oftentimes more noise and more pain than the tools and solutions were worth. This kind of harkens back to the SMB conundrum in the first place. We can either have the tool and hope that the tool does everything that it was supposed to, or the operator. But when we only have a fraction of each, and we have an operator that's serving three jobs, and we have tooling that may not be properly tuned or properly configured, what we're left with is a lot of noise. According to Cisco research in 2018, almost half, 44% of daily alerts are not investigated because of this reason. There is simply too much noise. The noise to signal ratio is out of balance. So we may not be able to detect some of the very real attacks that are coming through just based on the flood of alerts and noise coming into the system. And this one's pretty obvious, smaller budgets, but it's worth noting as it creates a significant risk to the business and a significant opportunity for the attackers. These sub 2,500 seat organizations have much smaller budgets than their enterprise counterparts, but deal with many of the same attacks, meaning that they are often far less prepared to cope. For example, if we understand that a headcount to employ in-house security operations team for security monitoring, a headcount of 8 to 12 full-time employees would be needed to staff for that. Using round figures of $100,000 per headcount, you can see very rudely that we have run up a $1 million price tag per year for monitoring costs alone. This isn't including security engineering or incident response or our edge team or our endpoint team, any type of forensics needs. This is just to be able to detect incidents in real time on a 24/7 basis. Now, there are other ways to accomplish the same thing at a potential reduction in cost, but this is, if you were going to build it up, this is just a quick ROM that you can run internally. Other options are obviously co-managing with a service provider or outsourcing if that's something that makes more fulfilling for your organization. But having the ability to detect incidents and breaking through that noise and getting to the signal is something that all organizations should be looking to do. So now that we understand why we're a target, let's understand how we got to this point and what we can do to start covering our bases. From business risk, whether we want to admit it or not, all businesses have already made a decision, whether purposefully or not, about the amount of risk they are willing to take on from a cyber perspective, even if that decision is due to inaction or indecision. We all want low business risk, but often our risk appetite and tolerance point us in a completely different direction. So I ask, what is your risk speed limit? What is the risk speed limit of your organization? And we're going to talk about that. So one of the best ways I've heard risk appetite and tolerance explained is using the speed limit example. So if risk appetite for your organization is how fast was your company willing to go in pursuit of a new product line, in pursuit of a new customer, in pursuit of something that they really want to achieve. If you have a high risk appetite, maybe you're the Autobahn, maybe you do not have a speed limit. If you are a very cautious company, maybe you're in a school zone, maybe it's a 15 mile an hour speed limit. And if you're right in the middle, maybe it's a 40 or a 55 or somewhere in there. And the tolerance, your risk tolerance becomes the variance in that speed limit that's posted before you're going to get pulled over by a police officer and receive a ticket. If you have a wild variance, maybe you could do 75 and a 55 and not get a ticket. If you have a very low tolerance for risk outside of your appetite, then maybe 57 and a 55, get you pulled over to the side of the road. So this is just something to think about because our risk speed limit is very important in defining business risk. When we say we want low risk, but we also say we would do anything to sell into a big client or to get that new product line out to market quickly, our appetite does not align with our desire for low business risk. So when those two are at odds, something has to give, and more often than not, it is our security program that will leave us with gaps. So let's think about it for a second. And a lot of the things that we're going to talk about on this slide, only you within your organization are going to be able to answer. So I'm going to pose a lot of questions, because when it comes to business risk, you have to put yourselves, I can't tell you what your risk is for your organizations. You know your culture, you know your where your security program currently is today, and you know what you can currently do to move that up or down the sliding scale. So a lot of these will be thought-provoking questions that you can answer internally for your organizations. But with regard to the risk speed limit, if you asked 5 of your executive stakeholders within your organization what their risk appetite and risk tolerance would be for the organization, would you get similar answers? Or would there be a wide variety in appetite and tolerance? And would each of those people tend to view risk through the lens of their role only? Or would they be able to view it holistically from the organizational level on down? How did you end up where you are today? Was it a conscious decision on purpose through risk assessments and gap assessments, strategic planning, capability, maturity modeling? Was this a pragmatic approach to it? Or was it on accident, a natural progression towards chaos? And now we've kind of picked our head up and realized that maybe there's a misalignment in either stakeholders or where our business risk is currently and where it may need to be in order to be successful in the long term. How can you improve? Well, we're going to talk about this in an upcoming slide, but there are some cyber hygiene practices that can really help. Gap and controls assessments based on standards, capability maturity modeling to help track our progress, to take us from ad hoc into managed and into defined and into a more measurable state. This is an important one. What are the business drivers for your organization? Understanding this and not just thinking about it for a second and moving on, but truly understanding the business drivers for your organization are very important in order to having the right conversations with the right people. Are your business drivers based on your industry, based on compliance? Are they based on your security culture? Is there an undying quest for revenue and business growth? All of these business drivers lead you down a path to better understanding where you are in the business risk and where you can ultimately move. Is it about protecting the legacy of the C-suite and the board that have worked for years to build this? The more you know about the driving factors, the more that you will be better able to build your business case in a manner that solves for those drivers, which is very important when working a budget ask or getting funding for a new project or initiative. And all of that will become very important. And do you know where you're vulnerable? Do you know what your security culture is today? Probably. As you walk through the halls, if you see unlocked computers, if you see messy desks or clean desks, if you see people talking about customers in the hallway, or if you have stringent badged access and visitor check-in, people tend to know their security culture. Do you have vulnerability data? Do you know where your vulnerabilities are? Do you know what your patch status is? Remediation planning. Knowing where you are weak is the first step in correcting it and closing those gaps. So now we've talked a lot about this. This was meant to just be a thought-provoking and question-asking to take us from business risk, because now what we're going to focus on is how to get towards cyber resilience. Cybersecurity as a discipline has come a long way over the years, as has our protection needs and defensive techniques to keep pace with the constant evolution of threats. Now, the thought behind this graphic is simple. As the cyber threats continue to evolve, so must our cyber sophistication and protection measures in order to keep pace in our quest towards cyber resiliency. now that we've oversimplified it, let's unpack it a bit more. So we can see we have security 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Security 1.0 meant to be where the threats were. Security 2.0 is where the threats are. And security 3.0 is where the threats are going, and fast, I might add. So in security 1.0, hygiene is key. 10 to 15 years ago, if you had a firewall configured to best practice standards, good patch management practices, and centrally managed endpoint protection, you were well protected from most cyber threats most of the time. But in the current threat climate, I would argue that this is the bare minimum level of cyber hygiene that you could have in place and expect to have a viable business at this time next year. It has gone from a great, robust cyber practice to now the bottom rung on the cyber ladder. And the only thing that has changed is the evolution of threats. And in security 2.0, where the threats are, detection becomes a very key role. It becomes almost a cyber hygiene plus layers of defenses plus having the ability to detect incidents. In today's threat climate, having your logs aggregated and monitored centrally on a continuous basis gives us the best chance to detect security incidents. According to this year's FireEye M-Trend 2019 report, dwell times, and a dwell time, for those that don't know, dwell time being the time when an attacker penetrates a system to the time that the attacker is detected. So they're inside your network, they've penetrated the perimeter to the time that someone has detected the attacker inside the environment. So according to the FireEye M-Trend report, dwell times are falling, but still have a median time of 78 days in 2018. That means that a median time of 78 days, 2.5 months, on average, attackers are inside our systems without being detected. And when we filter it down a little differently, this rises to 184 days when we look at only the notification from external parties. So where the internal teams or some of the SMB groups didn't, and even the enterprise groups didn't have the ability to detect the incidents internally, and they were notified oftentimes through state and federal law enforcement because the data that was exfiltrated by the attacker has ended up on the dark web or somewhere else. That has a dwell time of 184 days, 6 months. So 3 months or 6 months, let's just all agree, is way too long for an attacker to be inside your network without being detected. Layers of defenses, hardening the human firewall, and give yourself a fighting chance with log aggregation and monitoring, all become critical aspects of this security 2.0, where the threats are. And moving on, and security 3.0, and where the threats are going and fast, response becomes the cornerstone of this. And some of the advanced threats are already here. So that's a kind of a tickle for exactly how quickly they're moving and how quickly we, in order to maintain our cyber resiliency, need to move as well. And the cyber industry is moving quickly to speed up our response capabilities through orchestration and automation platforms, some advanced endpoint detection and response programs and applications as well. And in this phase, detection continues and will become more of a commodity with the continued rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the real focus becomes response in this high stakes game of cat and mouse. The key metric here in Security 3.0 is breakout time. Stop the attacker before they can achieve their target objective, the exfiltration of data typically. So breakout time is exactly that. Is the time it takes from an attacker to break into your environment, move laterally, and pivot to the target machine and accomplish their desired task, oftentimes the exfiltration of data. That breakout time, based on the sophistication of threats and the sophistication of threat actors, continues to drop lower and lower. So our response and the speed at which we respond needs to also become shorter and shorter in order to keep up with these advanced threats. Now, CrowdStrike's Global Threat Report 2019 talks about the 1-10-60 rule to combat these advanced cyber threats. And I really think the 1-10-60 rule is a really good one for internal teams and other security providers to focus on as something that they strive for. And it follows something like this. So the 1-10-60 rule: you must be able to detect an incident in 1 minute. You must be able to investigate and scope that incident in 10 minutes or less. And you must be able to respond and remediate the incident within 60 minutes. 1-10-60. Now, without a repeatable plan for response, you will fail every time. And even with a repeatable plan, 60 minutes is still not a lot of time for response. Endpoint isolation, response playbooks, security orchestration, and automation for response. These are all things that can help shorten that amount of time to help get us under those windows. This becomes increasingly important when response is the cornerstone of mitigating these evolving threats. Response actions that once took 30 or 60 minutes and coordination across multiple teams can now take seconds. Efficiency gains to level the playing field. Now, keep moving this chart out. What does Security 4.0 look like? I won't even try and crystal ball that one, but you can be sure that the threats will continue to evolve and that the bar to achieve cyber resiliency will be pushed higher and higher with each new threat evolution. Which moves us on to cybersecurity recommendations for the SMB. So we've talked about the threats that are out there. We've talked about why the largest companies can bounce back. We've talked about why our company may not be able to bounce back. Now, what can we do internally to make great strides forward and to close the gaps that we have internally and harden our environment and move ourselves towards cyber resiliency? Well, it's simple. We're going to start with cyber hygiene. And I know many of you on the call today are probably rolling your eyes right now because, okay, I get it, Tim. We've already got this. We've got this in the bag. But do you? Cyber hygiene is still one of the things that is overlooked. Not across all bases, but this is one of those measure twice, cut once. If I had a nickel for every time an edge-facing AWS server was breached just based on a misconfiguration, I would be at least a wealthier man than I am today. Then that's going to give us an inclination into how some of this happens just based on just pure cyber hygiene. Other things: hardware and software inventory, complex passwords, user awareness, OS and software patching, limitation of administrative privileges. All of these things fall under cyber hygiene. So we must take a real hard look, and we must know and not just talk about cyber hygiene, but know that we have those things in place and continue to monitor for changes in those environments. Awareness and assessment. Here, knowledge is power. Periodic vulnerability assessments so that we know where our vulnerabilities are and are remediating them. Knowing and not remediating them is almost worse than not even scanning for vulnerabilities. So here, we need to constantly be aware of what is out in the wild about our organization in terms of our vulnerabilities, both internally and externally. Know your gaps. We're going to start by using a standard if we don't already, whether it's the NIST cybersecurity frameworks, Center for Internet Security, Critical Security Controls, ISO 27001, whether you're bound by HIPAA, PCI, the Aussie top 35 controls, it really, if you do not have any to use, pick a standard and use it, whatever makes sense for your organization. And you're going to find your current state where you are right now and your target state where you're going in the longer term. And you're going to use those 2 points to build your roadmap and prioritize your investment. And we like to prioritize our investment by finding the project that closed the most significant gaps, i.e. have the largest positive security impact to the business with the least level of effort. Level of effort either being dollars or time, opportunity cost. And we start with those. Oftentimes you'll refer to this as the low-hanging fruit, which is exactly what it is. Every organization will have this low-hanging fruit or gaps that can be closed quickly. Start there, make significant progress. That progress will show the management structure that you have made significant movement towards a desired goal or outcome, and should get an additional round of investment for additional projects to continue to close the gaps. Become defensible, due diligence. Now this one's interesting. Take a look at your environment. I want you to look at it the way a court system would, through a legal lens. Given your budget, attack surface, and industry, are you following the reasonable persons rule? That is, are you showing due diligence in protecting your data assets? If you have admin as the username and password on your edge equipment, the answer is probably not. But if you can make a case for why you chose to protect certain attack surfaces and not others based upon your budget constraints using an industry recognized standard like the cybersecurity framework or the critical security controls, then you can make a strong case for due diligence in your environment. You've gone a long way to creating a defensible organizations against threats and in the legal sense. So if you do not have the budget to fulfill all 20 critical security controls, but if you said, you know what, I did have enough to start with the top 5. I've limited administrative privileges. I have a hardware, software, asset inventory. I have strong systems security, and I'm doing patching. And that's what I had, and that's what I could afford in my budget. I would say that you still have a defensible organization, and you have shown due diligence within your organization. So that's something as to often occasionally take a look through that lens as well. Centralized log collection. This is something that is important for any organization, and I know that there's something to be said for. We're going to split into 2 parts. One, centralized log collection, the aggregation of all of the disparate logs within your environment, from your servers, from your workstations, from your firewalls and switches, bringing those in centrally. And then the other part of that is, if there is budget for it, obviously we want to monitor those on a 24/7 basis. But in order to properly scope an incident, you must have centralized log collection. If you do not have the logs and artifacts for forensics reference, then the scope of the incident by default must become all records for a compromise. So just think about this for a second. If you have a way to contain and have these logs centrally collected, and if we do not do that, and we have an attacker breach our perimeter and get in and access some of our data, the immediate default scope of that incident becomes all records, because we are not able to scope an incident and prove differently. This might wildly expand the scope of your breach, and possibly unnecessarily so. So the cost to aggregate the logs can be controlled. Syslog server, leveraging the ELK stack. These are great first step options. Obviously, continuing monitoring of those logs on a 24/7 basis is the most preferred option for near real-time detection, either internally or in partnership with an MSSP, but log aggregation at a bare minimum is key. Plan your response. An independent UK-based research firm, Vance & Bourne, interviewed 3,100 IT decision makers between December 2018 and January 19 across organizations ranging between 100 and 5,000 employees, and found that more than 2/3, 68%, of organizations said they were hit by a cyber attack last year. This means that they experienced a cyber attack that they were unable to prevent from entering their network and/or their endpoints. This definitely tells me, and should definitely tell each one of us, that it's a when, not an if scenario for our organization falling victim to a cyber incident. Everyone should assume that they will be the victim of a cyber attack and prepare accordingly. This means that we must be prepared to respond. Build a cyber response plan and escalation communications matrix for your organization if one does not exist, and test them with scenarios in advance of the real thing. Tabletops and scenario testing are great ways to gain the insights necessary to bolster the plans and ensure that stakeholders know their roles when an incident does occur. Too often we find organizations put all of their security budgets into protection and detection side of security incidents with nothing left over for response. As you can see above, this is not a winning hand. I'll challenge you with this. Divide your budget in your mind, if you know it, into 3 distinct areas, 1/3 each for protective, detective, and response portions. Figure out how much you will spend next year to protect your business, and how much you will spend to make sure that your business can respond and recover successfully. Layer your defenses. Do you have the best firewall, the best endpoint protection, the best email security? Good. Those are all great protective layers of defense, but should not be your only safety nets. The goal must be to ensure that no single attack can disable all protection layers. Let's take ransomware, for example. Comes in through email as an attachment, and your first layer of defense is, was it caught by the email security and moved to quarantine? If not, you have a second layer. Did the user receive enough awareness training to recognize the threat and report or delete the email? If not, third layer. If the malicious code was executed by the user, did the endpoint protection recognize the attack technique and protect the machine from the crypto attack, roll back any file changes, and quarantine the executable? If not, fourth layer. Do you have an endpoint detection and response platform capable of isolating that endpoint from the network, talking to other machines, or talking out through the firewall while you investigate further? If not, fifth layer, do you have a functioning incident response plan at the ready to limit the potential damage of the incident and inform stakeholders of the situation in a timely fashion? As you can see, any one of these layers could have helped to reduce the size and scope of the potential business impact of the cyber incident in this scenario. But having just one, and the incident quickly becomes devastating to the organization. And last but not least, be realistic. Only you know the security culture in place at your organization and the appetite for business risks. There will always be risks within any organization that cannot be mitigated, avoided, and are still too high for the organization to accept outright. In these cases, we must look at risk transfer through a cyber insurance policy. The cyber insurance industry has come a long way over the last 5 or 10 years and is improving all the time. Recommend that the organization reviews a separate cyber insurance policies for these exact risk transfer purposes. No matter how large our cyber budget or enterprise our organization, we know that we cannot prevent all cyber incidents from occurring, but we can continue to take steps towards cyber resilience. So in conclusion, I hope you have found this conversation informative as to the types of cyber threats faced by small and mid-sized organizations and what we can be doing proactively to thwart these advanced attackers and make our businesses more resilient, one step at a time. And with that, I will open it up to some questions from the audience now.